Hi, everyone. Welcome. Celia, we good to go? Tamaisha, Christine, good. All right. All right, welcome, everyone. It's very lovely to see you here in this first of the special edition mini-series within the UWC Unlocked Talks. As you probably know already, the series is called Meeting at the Crossroads, a dialogue on race relations. And it's going to be in 3 parts, today, tomorrow, and Thursday. And it is organized and led by 3 of our brilliant alumni, Tamaisha Eytle, Dr. Rachel Twice-Williams, and Juan Antonio Nelson. Celia and I will be on hand to answer any technical questions that you have, so please send those directly to us, to either of us, that's fine. And as with all of the Unlocked Talks, please keep yourselves on mute during the presentation unless you're called upon by the moderator or you're added to the speakers list. So on the note of the speakers list, if you have a question, please write it in the chat and we will try to call on as many of you as possible. Of course, there'll be time constraints. So we probably, as always, won't get to all of the questions because everyone's always super engaged. If you don't wish to ask your question out loud, but you just want to write something down, just indicate that in the chat and we won't call on you. We'll just treat it as a comment. So you're very encouraged to comment on things and pose questions that you don't want to actually ask out loud. Just leave a little note if it is a question and we won't call on you. So especially because we are such a large group, which is awesome, we just please ask you to be especially mindful of the keeping yourself on mute. And when you are speaking, to keep time in mind so that we get a chance to hear from as many voices as possible. And on that note, just a thought on speaking and sharing throughout these talks, throughout all 3 of them. We may be touching on some deeply emotional topics, so please take care of yourself if anything becomes too much. And feel free to leave the meeting at any time. There's no explanation necessary. And if you have an incident of racism or racial discrimination at UWC to report, please feel free to contact your school or the UWCIO through the safeguarding section of uwc.org, which Celia is just going to link into the chat, and we will link it again at the end of the talk. So with that bit of housekeeping covered, and of course, if there's any questions, just let me know on any of the topics or Celia. But with that covered, it is my absolute honor to introduce our moderator for today. Tamaisha is a UWC Mahindra alum from 2005 to 2007. She is a regional representative for the Americas region on UWC's CNC and is the executive director of the Barbados Environmental Conservation Trust. She is joining us today from Barbados, and we are so grateful for her invaluable energy and time in organizing this series and for moderating for us today. So over to you, Tamaisha.
Good morning, good evening, good night to everyone, and thank you, Sarah, for that great introduction. What a time to be alive and be part of the UWC movement. It's pretty overwhelming to see such a response. I'm going to not look at the screen with all the faces staring at me. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly. Thank you, everybody, for joining. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Tamaisha Eytle. UWC alum for 13 years now. I have, some of you on here were my teachers back when I was there. And I am a proud member of the movement and I'm a proud alum, and I work really hard to ensure that I live the mission as much as possible. But recently, in recent times, you know, it's been a moment of introspection as to what that really means. So how this all started, I need to contextualize what's happening right now. Race relations are nothing new in the world, we are very aware of this. However, with the recent spike in incidences in the United States, one of the alumni I actually selected to go to UWC, he started the conversation in the UWC alumni Facebook group. And if you're a part of that Facebook group, you've seen where that conversation has gone. And what it made me realize is that as alumni, we needed a space to speak, we needed a space to vent, we needed a space to talk and express what the feelings of the world right now and the feelings of the introspection that many have been going through and reflecting on their UWC experience. Another alumni reached out to me and said, Tamaisha, we need to do something. How about we just, in true UWC style, have like a global affairs, global politics session on this. And so I said, okay, let's do it. Let's create this space, because it seemed as though we needed to take the conversation from just comments on a page to a more broader perspective, and really help us to look at everything from a big macro level picture, to then start the conversation and then start the movement of really having a moment of pause and a moment of reflection on our mission and our values as UWC. I think here we are with a webinar series. This is just the beginning. This is a conversation that's been happening in different circles for many years, but clearly the time is now, the tide has shifted, and it's important for us to really make this a priority as a movement. The question that was asked, is what is UWC doing? And then the question I asked myself, so who is UWC if not me as an alumni, and if not all of us as stakeholders in the movement? So I think it's time for us to reflect and have this very difficult discussion, and have this very hard time to think through what is happening globally, and what's happening with ourselves, and what's happening as a movement. So in order to make this conversation start somewhere, the IO team and some of the other alumni and I gathered and said, how are we going to tackle this massive issue? And they said, there's this amazing professor of whiteness. And I was like, this sounds genius. Who is a professor of whiteness? Because I think we needed somebody from outside the movement to help answer some of the questions. We've all had various experience and exposures to theories of race and diversity and equity and inclusion. But the particular moment of race relations in the USA has a particular meaning. And I think we all needed a refresher to get those cobwebs out of our brains, and also educate. In the last couple of weeks, trust me, I've learned so many acronyms I didn't know existed. So we have brought the lovely and the beautiful Christine Goding. Did I say that right? I hope so. Goding-Doty. Christine is a dual PhD candidate. She really loves school and education. This is great. Right in line with the UWC movement, in African American Studies at Northwestern University, and philosophy at École Normale Supérieure à Paris. Look at her with her fancy global experience. She has long-standing experience in the concept of whiteness, critical race theory, Black political thought, and post-colonial studies. Christine will help us to unpack the broader history around race relations in the USA leading up to the present situation. And I want to hand it over to Christine now. I am here to moderate and give questions and help facilitate the questions. Christine is here to kind of give us the broad strokes and make this interactive and fun and engaging. It is a heavy topic, so we want to make sure this is a safe space for everybody to ask the honest questions. We are all still trying to learn about what's happening in the world around us. So thank you very much, Christine, and I'm handing it over to you. And I'm in the background. Feel free to message me privately if anything.
Okay, great. Hi, I feel bad. I think whatever bio I sent you must have been an outdated bio.
Great, update us.
Yeah. So for the last 2 years, I've been a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in their Center for the Humanities and the English department. And in the fall, I'm going to be joining the faculty of Hobart William Smith as an assistant professor of Africana Studies. So that's just where I am now. But you're right. I work on the concept of whiteness, and I am a critical cultural theorist, and that means that I do conceptual work that also has to do with the sort of cultural production of the day. So I work on the concept of whiteness, understanding it conceptually as the organizing mechanism of power in the modern state. Okay, and that's the sort of frame that I want to give you for the little background I'll give you about like what my work is, and then the things that I've been asked to talk through today, so that I can, if there are questions about what I mean when I invoke whiteness, I want us to be able to start to think about race and whiteness as a kind of organizing mechanism for how society works. I am not actually interested in sort of drilling down on like what white people are doing or what non-white people are doing. I'm more trying to think about like, what are the social relationships that we are all embedded in and how do we participate in them? Okay, so I focus particularly on how race is performed in the context of the digital age and in digital media. And in my research and my teaching, I understand or I approach the digital age as a kind of stage of the post-colonial era. The term post-colonial for me in my work marks the end to formal decolonization in many places, but also the simultaneous shift away from explaining modern power in the terms of colonization and the transformation of colonial practices or the practices of empire into a number of different areas. So we can think about, you know, the shift away from talking about spheres of influence to instead talking about neoliberalism and globalization. You know, the erasure of terms of colonial occupation that are used in national rhetoric, so that settler colonies like the United States or Australia or Canada or Israel normalize their occupation by adopting liberalized policies of multiculturalism and diversity, right? As opposed to talking explicitly about their relationship to land as one of empire. And that's a shift that happens historically because at the beginning of the 20th century, the invocation of empire was done unproblematically, right? But over the 20th century, there's this shift away from calling empires empire. And instead trying to talk through domestic liberalized policies that offer increased enfranchisement, as opposed to really thinking about reparative measures or, God forbid, actual politics of decolonization. And so the that sort of transformation and the effects of that transformation and what is called like a process of unmarking, the legacy of that is what we're dealing with now, right? But the legacy of that also means that we have reached a moment where the public conversation about race has been basically stripped of its vocabulary. We've unmarked what it is that we're talking about, and we're left with very little in order to name the relations of power that we're really actually living under or with which we are complicit. Okay, so that's what my research looks at, but I'm not a historian. My work focuses on the 21st century. And so focusing on the 21st century, hopefully today I can offer a little bit of perspective in the sort of shifts and momentums that bring us to the present. My goal, at least in this short little session, is to offer intellectual resources to give you all increased strategies to name and reframe and talk about what we are dealing with, which is actually the sort of legacy of colonialism and empire, and not just a kind of amorphous, you know, question of like moral attachments or maybe increased hate or things like that, right? The sort of like moral rhetoric that circulates in the media is not very sharp in its descriptive capacity, right? So that to me, I think, is the first step in being able to talk about something like race relations in the United States. So anyway, so Tamaisha had sent me a list of 4 points that she'd asked that I cover. And I just want to give you that outline so that you know where we're going over this talk, now that you know a little bit about what I research and what my approach is. So the first one was an overview of the situation in the United States and what it means now, okay? And the way that I interpret that in how we talk, like what we'll talk about today, is that I first want to be able to broaden the view beyond the United States and broaden our view of what the United States is, which is to take some time to reinterpret the United States itself as empire. And I'm doing this explicitly because I know that this is, UWC is a global organization and you all are everywhere, right? And I think it's hard in the global nature of the current protests to say that this is only a US problem, but it is easy to imagine that what is being taken up globally is maybe solidarity with what is US problem, right? And I want to kind of turn that idea on its head, right? What we're dealing with is actually a global problem that we're seeing in the United States and elsewhere. Okay, so the second point was about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. In order to talk about that, I think the important thing that we'll talk through is the idea that at the heart of modern empire is the invention of whiteness. Okay, whiteness, I will talk about this, but All Lives Matter represents the sort of normalized consolidation of racial inequality and hierarchies that sort of maintain in these neutral, unmarked rhetorics and allegiance to white supremacy. And the last two points were the questions of acronyms and allyship and solidarity. And so the point that I'll make at the end is the idea that dismantling these relationships of power goes beyond what we have come to think of as allyship and coalitional politics. And hopefully we'll be able to see that, you know, allyship, that's actual solidarity goes beyond allyship if we are able to think about this in global terms, okay? So those are the points that I'm going to make. Throughout, I have a bunch of books that I've pulled, a bunch of readings that I will reference as places to do more reading in case you are interested. I've sent the list of the readings that I'll reference to the organizers, so they will share that PDF with you. So you don't have to, you know, write down the book number, you know, the book title and author. That's already done for you, okay? Okay, so to get into it, on the first point of the overview of the situation in the US and what it means now, the lens that I want to suggest is that we broaden our view beyond the US and start to think of the US as empire. So one of the reasons why we have to think about the US as empire is because the United States as a place depends on both the displacement of Native people and the importation of other colonized populations in order for its economy to begin. Okay, so that starts with the, you know, obviously the 13 colonies and the US as a colonial territory of England. But at the moment when the United States wins its independence from England, it takes over the colonial project in expanding from the East Coast to the West, and has never actually only been a territory of federated states, but has always been a place that has included colonized territories and commonwealths, and has engaged into the present day in the occupation of land within and beyond the United States. So there's a great book that was recently written called How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. And one of the great contributions that he makes with this book is that he demonstrates that the United States, which is usually seen as a sort of pinnacle of liberal democracy globally, has been able to achieve this reputation by unmarking its occupation of territory. So he uses two concepts. He says that, first of all, people who are in the United States, and also just more broadly, think of the United States in terms of what he calls the logo map. That's this. That's this image of the United States that's basically just the contiguous 48 states. It does not include Alaska and Hawaii. And so in the book, which I recommend that you read, it's very well written, and it's written for a popular audience as well, so it doesn't get really heavy, which a lot of academic writing can do. And so his book suggests that instead of thinking about the United States in terms of the logo map, that instead we should be thinking about it in terms of the greater United States, which in 1941, which is when he begins his book, actually looks like this. This is the contiguous United States and all of its occupied territories to scale. which is a very different image of the United States, considering, I mean, many people don't think of Alaska as being so large, half of the, you know, the literal territory of the United States. And they don't think of relationships between the United States and places like the Philippines as ever having been understood as part of US empire, but they were, and they were very explicitly understood as such. And the book does lays out a very compelling history of the way that the United States understood itself as an empire among empires, that its independence from England was the first step in it being an equal among European powers and world powers. And the expression of that power was achieved through the colonial project, through the expansion of territory, and the building of economy through all of the modes that come with colonialism, which include racial slavery and include various kinds of indentured servitude and forced labor through different means. Okay, so that is a great book for understanding how the United States really constructs itself through empire. I'm sort of flying through these things because I only have a half hour to get you from then to now. So we can talk more about what I mean by empire if it's confusing at all, or, you know, if I'm going too fast. But that book will start you off on understanding the United States as an empire that saw itself as, you know, among a bunch of peers, and that, you know, if there's any question of whether or not the United States was working off of the model of empire, I have another set of books for you that I would suggest that demonstrate how British Empire really became the model that was followed in the United States in terms of the way that it set up its social relations and in terms of the tools that it used. So one of the things to really think about when we're thinking about the legacy of empire and this moment of globalization is that colonial powers collaborated with each other. Colonialism was always a system that attempted to consolidate economic and political power, but it was done through trial and error. And there were, you know, there were various tools that were invented and then discarded, depending on whether or not they were actually efficacious in establishing the economic gain that was meant to come by being a colonial power and by establishing an empire. And so that also meant that even though there was competition amongst empires, in the literature that they were producing, in the policies that they adopted, they really spoke directly to each other and shared best practices and shared what didn't work. So in How to Hide an Empire, Immerwahr, who's the author, talks about in the late 19th century, how when basically, according to all the imperial powers, all of the land was already occupied globally, people started to look to the sea and started to think about naval routes and the ocean as the new place to expand empire and to expand the sort of sphere of influence of national and imperial control. Okay, and so, you know, there's an American writer who's writing about it, and his book gets translated into 10 other languages in order to, you know, provide intellectual resources for how to do empire. In this book, which is called The Invention of the White Race by Theodore Allen, this is one of my favorite books. It's 2 volumes. But it starts with the English occupation of Ireland, and then moves into the practices of the Virginia colonies in the United States. Those are the 2 volumes. And what is helpful about this book is that it gives us, first of all, the context of empire for understanding how race comes about. And it demonstrates this sort of collaborative legacy where different imperial powers are borrowing terms and tools from each other. It works through all of the ways that, especially in the first volume, the modes of English empire were tested throughout the colonies, and the colonies literally served as a kind of, lab, an experimental sort of lab for figuring out how colonialism worked best. But especially in the second volume, where he talks through the Virginia colonies, he really demonstrates that the invention of whiteness itself came through the same kind of haphazard trial and error. Okay, so whiteness as a category is invented in 1690 in the Virginia colonies. And it's invented with the very particular purpose of maintaining the economic viability of the colonies. So for a long period of time, the labor that was brought to the United States, to Virginia in the British colonies, was Irish labor. And, it was generally Irish indentured servants who were held in bonds that were not technically lifetime bonds, but in their practice were often lifetime bonds, because the work that they were meant to endure usually killed them very quickly. And eventually the British, adopting practices from other, sort of collaboratively from other empires, also drew on Black labor and brought African bond laborers who were in lifetime bonds, right? They were enslaved. And what happened in the Virginia colonies is that generally bond laborers of all descriptions understood the conditions that they lived through as linked. They did the same work. They were oftentimes under different sorts of policies that were put in by the Virginia colonial powers, forced to intermarry or encouraged to intermarry and have children in order to reduce the freedom and the limited bond labor of Irish indentured servants and make the economic relationship more closely resemble that of Black Black bond laborers. And because they saw their lives and their living and working conditions as linked, they rebelled en masse. And in order to put down these rebellions and make sure that they didn't happen again, eventually, British colonists in the Virginia colonies decided to create a new designation that would mark Irish indentured laborers as fundamentally different from Black bond laborers. And they said, essentially, you are no longer one mass of hyper-exploited working people. You are two separate groups. Irish bond laborers are white and Black bond laborers are Black. That means that white bond laborers should feel an affinity to white capitalists who are essentially working you literally to death for white capitalist profit. And that distinction was rejected in the beginning by bond laborers because they didn't live a material reality that suggested that whiteness meant anything. And it was through trial and error, again, that eventually the political organization of the Virginia colonies creates enough incentives for white bond laborers to accept the idea that they are white, to actually begin to institute racial hierarchy in the Virginia colonies. Okay? So the point of me going over that history is to indicate that, the way we have come to understand race, because of all of the literature that's been produced since that moment, in order to explain colonial rule and in order to explain the order of the modern world, has talked about race as though race were a pre-existing natural condition where you could go around the globe and find different, people of different races. At every stage of history, this has been done in different vocabularies, right? We can think back, cringing at, old 18th and 19th century texts that tried to say that there were 5 races, Negroid and Mongoloid and Caucasoid and those sorts of terms that we don't use anymore, right? But so at each stage, we've gotten new vocabulary to describe what race is. But if we look at the material history of race, what we find is that whiteness and all of the other racial categories were invented as a colonial technology in order to organize labor and maintain a certain kind of economic power and cohesion, for which different kinds of political incentives were at some times offered. Okay. And because whiteness and race is such an effective tool, it turns out, in order to make people comply with the various levels of economic exploitation to which they were subjected, it became a kind of globalized register so that we understand whiteness globally, and various people that, you know, come from different traditions of European empire may be described in this moment as all white. Okay, that I want to suggest to you that like there were several different organizations of racial hierarchy depending on which empire you're looking at. But over the last 500 years, we have essentially consolidated them under one dominant rubric that is generally applied globally. And we can see that as a result of the kind of collaborative trial and error methods of colonialism, and the fact that colonialism as an economic project of profit was spread globally because what they needed at the time was land in order to secure economic profit. Okay. Okay, and the legacy of that is essentially that, you know, I mean, we have to remember that like at the time that whiteness as a category is invented, people are living under really horrible conditions. In general, the bond terms for white indentured or bond laborers was 7 years, but in many parts of the colonies, the life expectancy of a bond laborer who maybe wouldn't survive seasoning, which is the sort of first part of forced labor, was generally 4 years. So practically, people were being put in lifetime bonds because they probably wouldn't survive long enough to work to the end of their bond. Statistically, I mean, certainly many people did, but it wasn't easy. And so, you know, when people were offered at different stages, different kinds of political incentives that would basically say, you know, like you would not be subject to the kinds of horrible living conditions of, you know, your counterparts. You know, we might be able to understand why the attachments to those artificial distinctions came about, because for many people, this is a question of life and death. Okay. Over time, it becomes a question of increased privilege, but in the beginning, it starts as a question of life and death. Okay, so in talking about the relationship between Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, and trying to keep that original context in mind, I also have no idea how much time I have. Tamaisha, can you tell me how much time I have?
Keep going.
Okay. I often with my students will like ask me little questions that send me off on a rant. We're supposed to talk about like Twitter or something, and then they ask me about the Virginia colonies, and I'm like, blah, 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 blah. And then time is up. So please, you know, keep me aware of time. Okay, so talking about the relationship between the invocation of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. What I really want to point out here is that this is the sort of modern day latest example of how this inheritance of, you know, sort of colonial practice of taxonomizing people in the service of making a hierarchy that would be economically advantageous, didn't just remain like a taxonomic practice, right? I mean, we have the whole canon of Western history and literature and political writing and international relations, and I mean, a list of subjects and academia that it would take me an hour to recite. Because as the modern world is consolidating itself and establishing itself, it is also explaining itself to itself, okay? And depending on whether or not it is, let's see, seen as uncouth to talk about people in terms of racial epithets, we might find a shift in language, like in the mid 20th century, that was not present 100 years earlier, okay? But we have had many huge shifts, right? There has been a global program of decolonization from many places. And we should not kid ourselves that that was achieved by, you know, an unrelenting legacy of the rejection of colonial order by colonized people. And we should be able to understand the absence of the history of those rebellions, the ongoing rebellion against total exploitation, the absence of that from the dominant histories of the West that we learn and of modernity as part of this mode through which the West has explained itself to itself as benevolent, as establishing civilization, and as entirely good. A book I want to suggest to you to read that sort of comments on that transition is this book, Discourse on Colonialism by Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire was from Martinique. He was a subject of French Empire and published this book in 1955, influenced by the Surrealist movement and other anti-colonial writers who he encountered in Paris in his studies. The main point that he makes in this book is that the rhetorics that explained empire up until that point as a civilizing mission, as something that brought advancement and modernity to otherwise backwards, savage people, and that made humans out of what were essentially animals, according to the sort of the logic of empire, didn't spread civilization and was not just neutral contact, but had the effect of decivilizing those people who were directly involved in the colonial enterprise, and you know, brought out and justified levels of brutality that are completely incompatible with notions of, you know, equality and liberal democracy and all of those, you know, good things that we get from the political order deriving from humanism and the Enlightenment, right? He's saying that, like, there's a rhetoric of Enlightenment ideals, and then there's the process of colonialism that funded the establishment of those Enlightenment ideals and funded the establishment of the society that is justifying its spread by saying that it is spreading Enlightenment ideals, but that in actuality, what it is spreading around is total misery and absolute destruction and the extinction not only of animals and ecology, but also of total ways of life and people. And what's beautiful about his text is that he cites all of the humanist thinkers who he was forced to read in his very elite education of the day. Aimé Césaire is born into the sort of colonial bourgeoisie of Martinique and is therefore educated in Paris with, you know, the other sons of empire. Yeah, so this is a great book for seeing some primary source examples of how colonialism was talked about as at once a kind of civilizing effort, but also was talked about by people who engaged in it in very bare terms, where, you know, they mention all of the activities that were part of the colonizing mission and the reason why they thought it was such a good thing. And that includes, you know, the assumption that colonial territories offered a kind of safety valve for colonial populations, meaning like populations from the colonial metropole, to go and exercise their sort of violent tendencies on a population that didn't really matter. Yeah, I'm not going to read to you. I'm not going to read to you from that because the example that I would give is very violent. You can read it yourself, but he demonstrates that, like, you know, even the way that people were talking about colonialism at the time ran against the idea that colonialism, you know, brought civilization anywhere that it went. Okay.
I'm gonna jump in really quickly and give you one more point, and then we're gonna open for some questions. I think you've taken us beautifully through the historical context of we've now made it to the 21st century. And I've been taking notes like I was a student, and there was one great comment that we should teach this to all our students in the movement, and I am now one of these students learning. But now we're in the 21st century, and we want to hear your perspective on the current time and the manifestations of this history in the current time. And then we'll open for questions. So if you all have questions bubbling, start putting them down. We have one great one to start with shortly. But Christine, I'm going to give you that last 3.5 minutes.
Okay, I'll do it.
And then we're going to open the conversation. So let's go from there.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to read to you from my notes instead of like speaking contemporaneously. If we're going to be able to think about this moment as a reaction against the legacy of US empire and empire more broadly, we need to be able to talk about whiteness itself as a technology, as I mentioned before, as a kind of invention that was made to serve a kind of a particular purpose and has proved to be efficacious from then until now. And that it was invented in order to protect the profits of colonial economy, and that in its proliferation, it produces logics and rhetorics that justify itself. So one of the ones that we're learning, that we are dealing with today, especially in the 21st century, is that of color blindness. Color blindness is how we can understand this response to Black Lives Matter by saying all lives matter. It's a kind of colorblind politics. Colorblindness allows for an appeal to seemingly a liberal ethos in order to defend racial hierarchy and inequality, and in order to defend the technology of empire, which is the unmarking of empire, right? So the way that we get from Aimé Césaire and the people that he's talking about to the present is that he's showing, you know, not 20 years ago, people were bragging about the thousands and thousands of people that they murdered and watching their blood steam into the sunset. At the same time that they were talking about colonialism as the pinnacle of the spread of civilization, and as they are increasingly talking about colonialism as always benign, and as the relationship that's sustained between former colonies and the formal imperial powers and their maybe soon to be, because he's writing in 1955, soon to be released colonial subjects as always also benign. And so Césaire can point us to this period that we enter of unmarking and of the transformation of ethos into different modes. So the second transformation that I will very quickly try to talk about is the rise of neoliberalism. Quinn Slobodian, I offer 2 texts of his. One is an article. The other one is this book, The Globalists. I offer that on the reading list. Quinn Slobodian demonstrates the way that economic relationships were deliberately engineered in order to allow for formal decolonization to happen without upending the economic relationships between the global North and the global South. Okay, that's the economic part of it. There are other books that talk about, like this is The History of White People, talks about new rhetorics around art and cultural production that were sort of reframed to give whiteness a much longer history than it actually enjoyed, or books like this called White by Law, that demonstrates all of the legal sort of negotiations that were made and legal back and forth and trial and error that attempt to, where people who are subject to the sort of racial violence he's talking about in the United States are trying to challenge this by saying like, well, if the new language we're talking about race is that everybody is equal, then we are also equal and we should also be called white because white is the category that is the most enfranchised, right? And his book demonstrates the way that like whiteness is disassociated rhetorically from a position of strategic enfranchisement, and the whole process is kind of unmarked. And so one of the other popular political shifts that happens is this shift toward colorblindness that accompanies the rise, this is post-decolonization, post-civil rights movement, accompanies the rise of diversity and inclusion efforts and politics of multiculturalism, and results in the kind of culture wars of the 90s and then into today. A great resource for reading more about colorblindness is the work of Jessie Daniels. I put this article, this is a very, very short article, but Jessie Daniels works on whiteness and the internet. This article, The Algorithmic Rise of the Far Right, of the Alt-Right, talks through the use of the sort of meeting of the technology of whiteness with the 21st century technology of the internet. I don't know if I put this article of hers on the reading list, but I'll send it. It's called My Brain Database Doesn't See Skin Color, Colorblind Racism in the Technology Industry and in Theorizing the Web. And she talks about how using technology as one example of one industry that employs colorblind rhetoric, racial inequality becomes impossible to actually address if the language that we are supposed to use is one of universality and total inclusion. Okay, if I were doing a much longer talk on this, we could talk about how universalism as an ideal is also a technology of Western empire, because the aim of empire is to establish a universal norm, and that exists in several different sort of cultural and political corollaries, so that also the legal structure of Western polities value norms rooted in universalism, right? Like all people are created equal, things like invocations like that were penned even at the time of like really rampant inequality and exploitation. So anyway, All Lives Matter picks up this colorblind ethos, and colorblindness attempts to mark, thinking about colorblindness, and especially Jessie Daniels' term colorblind racism, attempts to mark where racial violence is happening in the absence of overt intentions. So, saying all lives matter is not calling someone an epithet. There's a kind of plausible deniability about what you actually mean. But if we understand it as participating in these rhetorics of color blindness, which are directly attempting to minimize the existence of racial inequality and the sort of material realities of racial hierarchy, we can understand that colorblind politics attempt to produce racial innocence off of the power that is often afforded to the intentions of the white subject that are made to only obtain to white subjects, and that simultaneously abdicates us from critical analysis, right? That's the sort of purpose of colorblind rhetorics, and it's why if we understand that invocation of all lives matter to be working through color blindness, we can see how actually it is complicit with racial violence. It is not neutral. It's not just some sort of universalist invocation.
All right, I'm gonna pause you on that note.
Mm-hmm.
They have some great questions coming in, and you can take a drink of water, Hello, everybody. I'm hoping you're still there. 130 people still going strong. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I haven't been in the academic space in a long time, so my brain's a bit fried from all of that, and it's a lot to really think about. And Christine, you mentioned at the beginning, you know, UWC is a global system and a global movement with quite a vast level of diversity, passport-wise and socioeconomic-wise. So lots of experiences, diversity of experiences is important. One of the questions that was going along in the alumni chat was, you know, but there are other inequalities that are racially driven. How does that work? So Theron poses a great question. I don't know if you want to say it out loud. I'll give you a couple of seconds on mute if you do. Can you unmute? I can't tell.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Ask your question. And let us know your affiliation to UWC as well.
Absolutely. My name's Theron. I'm a Pearson alum from 89 to 91 and actually work at the college now as well as live on the campus. And so Christine, just thank you for such an amazing history lesson for all of us. I think many of us are hungry for this kind of deeper understanding, and grateful for the treasure of your teaching this morning. My question was, so hearing your breakdown, for example, of the construction of racial identity with the Irish bond laborers and African bond laborers in the US, could you draw a line for us to what must be a similar kind of process that happened in Rwanda with the British construction of Hutu and Tutsi differences and the hierarchy between those, and how that, of course, led to such horrific events there?
That's a really incisive observation, because it demonstrates the kind of, I would say, experimental nature of imperial order, which is to say that policies that seemed to be effective in one place were exported to other places in order to maintain colonial order. So it's the exact same strategy. It's the exact same strategy. And you know, the strategy that's replicated in Ireland is the production of Scottish yeomen, the Scottish yeoman class, who is made as a kind of buffer between British and Irish rule in Ireland. And then in the United States, the buffer is made with the Irish bond laborers and the invention of whiteness as a sort of political positionality. But in other places across the African continent, it was a common policy of British imperialism and British colonialism to try to create a buffer class that could attain certain kinds of rights and could attain, you know, a certain kind of, you know, status, and operated as a kind of buffer managerial class. And you find that all over the place. I mean, the idea that Césaire is part of the colonial bourgeoisie, right? France did a similar, although not exactly the same kind of policy, but for many colonial orders, there was the production of a kind of managerial middle class that, in the wake of decolonization, caused all sorts of political problems, because you know, as has been reviewed, those groups of people were not distinct before colonialism, right? Everywhere that British colonialism went, they attempted to either invent or exacerbate pre-existing hierarchies. And so if there were pre-existing hierarchies, like let's say the caste system in India, it was turbocharged. Or you know, an invention of a real distinction between Hutus and Tutsis is established. That means that at the moment of formal decolonization, which, you know, the British Empire never intended to happen, right? No empire intended to establish itself assuming its own demise. But what it meant was that, you know, by that point, the material conditions under which people lived were so distinct that the British were able, you know, to sort of excise themselves from a situation that, you know, was just an overwhelming sort of overflow of animosity and pain. So it's a really smart observation, and yes, it's the same sort of strategy applied to different contexts. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you for that great question and response. Sydney Ross, you are next if you would like to unmute and talk.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, and introduce yourselves and your affiliation.
Okay. Hi, so my name's Sydney. I am an alumna from UWC Adriatic from the class of 2014, and I'm from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So my question was, as the Black Lives Matter movement has started a conversation about the existence of systemic racism globally, and having countries really kind of look within themselves and see what policies they have in place which mimic and what we have in the United States. So even from a historical point of view, I was wondering how, or do you think the concept of racism and in that Black identity and Blackness differ within the United States versus other countries? And kind of your thoughts on that.
Okay, so a few thoughts about racism first. As I mentioned before, part of the work that I do is theoretical, and it deals with the concept of racism. If you want more work on the concept of racism, it is a little bit dense, but Barner Hesse, who was my advisor, works on the concept of racism specifically. And it bears going over very briefly the history of racism. So as a term, it is invented in the late 19th century to mean patriotism and nationalism. It's used within Europe, where the idea is that a nation is a single race. And if you are a good racist, it means that you are a good patriot of your country. And because of the context between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, because of the rise in competition between empires, racism becomes this sort of like, term that describes an allegiance to your own nation's empire, and then takes a weird kind of left turn in Germany's invocation of racism that was not actually that much different than other invocations of racism, but made for a kind of weaponized nationalism that certainly all the other empires employed in the colonies in their ability to say that their race was superior to their colonial subjects, but up until that point had not been applied to the populations within Europe, and had not been employed as a tactic of competition amongst empires where the attacks were being made directly on the imperial metropole within Europe. And after World War II, racism obviously becomes a sort of decried ideology of, unspeakable, a logic of unspeakable hate and violence, but it is originally, even after World War II, only meant to describe the violence of Nazi Germany against Jewish subjects and against the other populations within Europe that it targeted. And, when I say the idea that like colonialism is something that is practiced, people of the time, anti-colonial writers of the time, who were having an international conversation with each other, said, if what happened in Nazi Germany counts as racism, and if racism is now a term that is widely rejected in Europe, which is a huge shift from how it had been accepted not 30 years earlier, then anti-colonial thinkers and writers said, what's happening here in the colonies must count as racism too. These same technologies were first practiced in the colonies. These same relationships and logics of superiority were developed on colonial people and in colonial relationships. And therefore, this is also racism. Now, among people who are writing anti-colonial literature, not everyone was satisfied with the term racism. Some people thought that because racism was only used to describe the use of colonial violence in this very particular context, that it didn't actually account for the centuries of colonial exploitation and violence that had already happened. And they pointed out that the appeals by anti-colonial thinkers to call the colonial situation racist were rejected in general by all of Europe. European philosophers who were writing about racism said what happened in the colonies was not racism because racism is an ideology that requires some kind of intellectual production, and you don't do that, nor are you capable of that. So there was a real split between anti-colonial writers who thought that like hitching their bandwagon for full political enfranchisement and for the end of this horrible violence and exploitation could be done by appropriating the term racism because within Europe it was seen as such a sort of repulsive idea. And there were people on the other side in these anti-colonial circles who said, talking about things in terms of racism is going to necessarily reduce the problem that we're talking about, okay? And when we think about how racism operates today, we have to think about how like it was a struggle for people to, for people in the colonies to get global populations, which really means the West, to get the West to acknowledge that what's happening globally is racism. And I want to, like in my theoretical work, I want to kind of hold open the shift that we make to talking about racism, because what racism has become, what racism has come to signify are moments of racial violence that are appropriate to, you know, sort of like name and call out, but that are also driven by some kind of intention and like usually some overt expression of bias, okay? Now, we might tend to think that that's not the case because we have terms like structural racism and institutional racism that try to get at these larger forms of inequality and racial bias that don't have to do with intention. But when it really comes down to it, you know, like in previous, you know, like in the, if we look at the trial of George Zimmerman for the shooting of Trayvon Martin, right? They weren't allowed to make the case that this was racist, that something racist had happened. Legally, they were not allowed to use that terminology. Mm-hmm. Okay? So it's not straightforwardly useful necessarily to think about racism because of the history of the term racism and also because of the limited use that it actually gives us when we're confronting institutions. And for my own work, what I try to think about is the sum totality of this taxonomic order and structure that is race, where some of the things that we understand as doing race make us feel bad, and some of the things that we understand as doing race are supposed to make us feel good, right? Those bad things, the things that make us feel bad, we understand as racism, or we call them racism. Mm-hmm. But that means that we do not indict this whole other side of it that really manufactures a kind of complicity with an organization that was initially produced as a technology to secure, you know, economic profit by eliminating solidarity.
So like through, oh, sorry.
I know that that's not exactly a straightforward answer to your question. I would say that like my final point that I was going to make is that the question of solidarity is often undercut by the way that we, you know, apply so much attention to the concept of racism and try to find it out in our supposed allies, right? There's a lot of writing about whiteness that talks about the kind of inherent racial bias in white people, right? When we can perhaps more effectively talk about it in terms of political commitments. Mm-hmm. Solidarity is constructed based on the political commitments that you are willing to make in terms of the vocabularies that you are willing to learn and deploy, and the conceptual frames that you apply to the political reality that you see. Mm-hmm. A lot of political discussion today is talked about in moral terms. There's a fantastic theorist called Chantal Mouffe. I didn't put her book on the list, but she writes about the moralization of politics, which is essentially, it derives from the modes through which the West has explained itself to itself over the last basically century, maybe 2 centuries, in moral terms, so that 2 political opponents are seen as good and bad, right? One is evil and one is righteous. These are moral terms that paper over the fact that if you have 2 political opponents, what they are proposing are 2 different material political realities, right? What they're proposing are different mechanisms and legal realities according to which people will be governed and will live their lives. So similarly, if we're going to move away from questions of moralization and understand that even if we name something as racism or as racist, that can easily be undercut by saying, well, someone didn't intend to do XYZ thing. A perhaps more efficacious, model of solidarity is to understand that actually our complicity in the legacy and transformation of colonial modes of governance has been produced and secured by our attachment to colonial taxonomies and might be dismantled by the kinds of acts of solidarity that attempt to imagine a world that operates according to different social relations. A world that says, like, if you are white presenting, you are supposed to have a certain amount of privilege, the attempt to subvert that privilege, to reject it, to be a person who can invoke colonial history and understand the present as linked to the past, right? So that's my response.
Thank you for that, and thank you for a great question. Wow, okay, we have 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure we get through a few more questions. Tanya McKenzie, would you like to ask your question if you're still there? And then we'll go to Rahel. I think you might have to leave, but Tanya, let's go.
Hi, Christine. So I'm Tanya, Atlantic College, 1984. Originally from Zimbabwe. At the moment, I'm based in Manchester, United Kingdom. Thank you for that great talk. I have spent today writing an article on colonialism and inequality in Zimbabwe. So my question to you is, national identity and self-identity is so linked in the history that we are actually taught as youngsters. And you've given a great overview of a very complex and very long history. Thank you very much. But what is being done in the United States to address that teaching of history in the classes, if anything, to allow for other minorities, and that being all ethnic minorities as well as majorities of different historic narratives, so that students can see that there's this kind of dualistic existence of how you identify yourself as American, and how then, in the way that it's taught, can students actually then look for not West knows best, there's one universal answer. How is that being addressed in an education system within a place like the United States?
Okay. It's not. That's the short answer. The history of education in the United States is so, excuse my language, it's so fucked up. But so in general, United States education has never formally integrated. I mean, it formally integrated. It definitely formally integrated. But the question of like actually desegregating schools and making sure that schools were not only getting the kind of education that they could afford off of their property taxes has never been troubled seriously in the United States. And so for the most part, most students, at least in K through 12 education, if they're public school students, are, I mean, we don't have like a US curriculum that like talks about slavery or settler colonialism in any real robust way. So, the education in the United States is a pro-US nationalist education that leaves students with a history of slavery that's basically, like the slaves were too lazy or dumb to rebel, and eventually there was a sort of moral revolution of abolitionists, and they were the good guys of history, and they were on the right side of history, and they emancipated slaves. And now we all live in a post-MLK McDonald's world. I feel like I'm being very bitter about this, but that's the reality of like the education that people get. And when I worked in K through 12 education, like I was practically having to deprogram my students from believing that slaves were dumb. Like these students felt like they wanted to distance themselves from their backgrounds because they felt like every message that they got was that these were people who were not smart enough to get themselves out of it. I mean, so anyway, that indicates the fact that like in the United States, we do not learn the material reality of the United States at all. We do not learn that the United States is a settler colony. We do not learn anything about the native expropriation of land. And that continues to this day, right? At the beginning of the coronavirus, the Trump administration, tried to destabilize the land claim of a native tribe in Massachusetts, like as one of the first policies of sort of shock doctrine in the coronavirus crisis. Yeah, so, I would say there's not much that's done. And in place of a history that actually deals with the material realities of how the United States got to be where it is, and how the United States education system got to be so segregated and then remained so segregated even after the end of Jim Crow and civil rights. Instead, we have, a very kind of milquetoast idea that the United States is a superpower and globalization is good, and it's, we learn the history of the West, right? Like that's still the sort of dominant global education.
Thank you for that. That was a great question. As UWC is an educational movement, that is what we are at our core. And so it is about us thinking as a movement of how are we deliberately educating with these gaps that are not filled in the education systems we work within, and what's happening. And that's part of a lot of the work that's being done by the movement. And one of our webinars will touch on this subject. So please join us on Thursday.
I will say just very quickly, the American Studies Association president recently released a statement called, it's the statement on the movement for Black Lives and the Rebellion of 2020. And it is by far the best institutional comment that I've heard that reacts to the current moment, because he really goes through what steps institutions of, for him, higher education, but education more broadly, can actually take in order to make reparative justice moves. So one of the very creative things that he suggests is, if universities make it a requirement that students arrive to college having learned about racial inequality in the United States, it's a mode through which they can use the power they already have, which is, the sort of like maintaining elite education structures, in order to force K through 12 education to have a conversation that it is otherwise absolutely resistant to having. So I recommend that as like a thing to read, thinking about, the sort of work of education and how it can respond to this moment.
Perfect. And it links, and I'm going to use my moderator's gavel to really wrap up the next few questions and summarize them. It's the what next of what can we do? How can we, Ed asked, how do you break the empire? How do you remove the structures that colonialism has in place? Cynthia asked, what can help make a difference now? And then Rahel asks, as you speak about reparative justice and reparative measures, how can reparations help? And the idea of reparations makes people uncomfortable, and white people and people in power uncomfortable. What could healing look like? So I'm going to give you that last, chance to have a look at all of this, and I'm going to look for the statement you just shared, spoke about and share it in the group as well. But if you can go on that tangent about what next, what can be done, and what are the further uncomfortable conversations we need to have.
Yeah. Okay. I would say, you know, in my work, I reach the I suggest for a reframing of how we think about race, how we think about racism, how we think about complicity with empire, right? But I also, especially with my students, point out that these are very deeply entrenched relations, that pulling them apart requires a real radical imagination that needs to be developed. So for example, in my work, I talk about the idea of doing whiteness. And one of the examples that I use is the building that I'm in right now. I think about the doing of race as something that two bodies have to be doing with each other. And so I think about the body of the building that's standing on the body of the land. And it's standing, it's like doing a relationship to the land. It is occupying the land and therefore instantiating the power of the state of Wisconsin, where I am, and, you know, instantiating all of the modes of economy that built this building, where the resources came from, et cetera, et cetera. And as I move through the building, I also enter this very long relationship of colonial occupation, and I become part of it. That's not me interacting with another person. That's not me being called a name or calling a name. That's not, right? That's a kind of bigger relationship that has to do with structural realities, that has to do with the sort of a bunch of sort of qualitative things as well. That I think we, in general, in our discussion about race and in the level of political education, that adult political education that we have more broadly, is not good at keeping in view. We're not really great at understanding what it is that we're saying when we mean the legacy of colonialism or empire. So for me, the first step is about actually developing that awareness, which means reading. That's how I do it. I mean, you can do it otherwise, I guess. It means seminars like this, but it means really doing the reading, right? It means actually doing the reading. And then it means, like, I mean, literally, you know, imaginative work to figure out, are the things that I feel like I should be doing reifying something or actually challenging and dismantling something, right? So on the question of reparations, right? Reparations do some part of dismantling the legacy of white supremacy in the United States by redistributing funding, right? Which should seem like, you know, maybe a less politically problematic thing right now, when so much of the conversation is about defunding the police and redistributing their multi-billion-dollar per city budgets to things like education and public housing and healthcare. Okay, so on the one hand, reparations also helps to destabilize this by redistributing funds. But if reparations is done in the name of just opening capitalism to more and more people, and I mark capitalism as, like, capitalism is the economy that is established through colonial order. That's, capitalism is the colonial economy, okay? So the question is, like, does pursuing reparations as a project of Black capitalism continue to destabilize the exploitative norms of the modern world? No, right? At a certain point, we will reach a limit where now what we have is like a rainbow coalition of people whose lives depend on the exploitation and misery of others. That doesn't fundamentally destabilize empire. It's why this moment that we're in of neoliberal globalization doesn't fundamentally destabilize empire. You have a decrease in movement amongst laborers and an increase of movement in capital, and therefore we have H&M being made by, you know, essentially bond laborers in Bangladesh, right? Like, there's, you know, whether or not the CEO of H&M were a person of color wouldn't destabilize empire, okay? So, you know, at each of our strategies, we have to have the radical imagination and the critical tools of analysis to understand, like, what things is this taking advantage of in the short term, and what dynamics of power is this complicit with in the long term, that either re-entrench empire under new names, if we understand that empire is constantly renaming and unmarking itself, and what makes it impossible for empire to reestablish itself, right? This is why, you know, in the history of the removal of Native Americans in the United States, many people try to say that, you know, maybe it wasn't that bad or something because there were certain Native tribes who owned slaves, right? Certain Native tribes participated in the colonial economy of US capitalism, which was based off of slave labor, right? Their incorporation into that system did not destabilize empire because they were Native people and not European, okay? And so, you know, it doesn't mean that they were, you know, we might understand their participation in that system as a response to, like, you know, I mean, they were essentially facing literal extinction, right? And so in negotiating their own lives and in negotiating the prospect of extinction, okay, they participate in colonial capitalism and engage in slave labor. But that doesn't necessarily make that a radical act. That makes it an act of survival. Okay, so we have to be able to develop the radical imagination to not confuse acts of survival with, you know, acts which actually dismantle and disrupt these power relations. And, you know, on how we do it and what we do, like, I don't have an answer for you. I'm very sorry. I don't have an answer because, you know, like, I think our critical capacities at this moment are actually quite weak to address that problem, precisely because the education and facility that people have in doing this kind of critical interrogation has been very strategically eroded and displaced from the education that we all get.
All right, we're just going to take a breath on that one. That's quite a powerful statement to end on. Wow, okay, so I'm going to turn back on my video, everyone. Hello again, it is me, it is I. Christine, thank you so much for this. This has helped to lay a really strong foundation for our next steps as a movement, and really critically assessing what we are doing to contribute to education, because as I said earlier, that is what we are. And educating our alumni, our staff, our stakeholders, the communities that we exist in, and our role as UWC in the current moment and the moments of the future that we're moving into. I came into these talks for the last few weeks being like, this is about blackness, this is about blackness, and having grappled with my own identity of what blackness means, I think I've now reached a position where it is about education. It's about education and deliberate education. There's so many other layers I can think of within the UWC movement, because we are so co-located in so many different countries. A deep dive into the issues of race relations in all the different contexts will help blossom such a beautiful new generation of learning for all of us, whether we're on a campus or not. And I think this will help us to set the stage for the next conversations we are going to have. We had a really great representation from so many different stakeholders in the movement, and it's beautiful to see. And it is about UWC breeds change makers. That's what we are in different ways, from the minor to the major, whatever you define that as. And I think it's you've really helped educate us and give us food for thought. My brain, this reading list, I haven't read academic readings in many years, and now I'm like, oh, I should read these books that aren't junk novels. And at a time where the world is grappling with so much other issues, and to think we have now another issue that to deal with, your approach to this topic has been not enraging, but very introspective. So I feel a lot more at peace and feeling that there is, you know, it's not a lost cause. It is not a lost cause that we're in. It's another phase in an evolution, not necessarily a revolution. So I really look forward to go for it.
I was just gonna say, because I understand the heft of jumping into academic reading, I want to point out the reading by Jesse Daniels and the reading by Quinn Slobodian that's called The World Economy and the Color Line. Those are articles, so they're much shorter. And there are a couple of books on here that are written for an explicitly popular audience. So Nell Irvin Painter's The History of White People, Daniel Immerwahr's How to Hide an Empire, and to a lesser extent, but you know, good to put on that list of like easier reading, Theodore Allen's The Invention of the White Race. Those are good places to start if you need to like work up to reading, you know, like Walter Rodney, or if you have to work up to reading Frantz Fanon, right?
Yes, I even put on my glasses to read the questions and some of the articles. But really, thank you. This blew my mind as to where this conversation could have gone, but I trusted you, I trusted the system, and I trusted the UWC community to join this journey. But this is only beginning, everyone. Thank you, Christine. Thank you to my IO staff in the background, for those who joined as spectators and for those who helped develop this series collaboratively. As I mentioned, this is alumni driven because we have all 60,000 plus strong alumni have come through UWC, and to realize that so many of us are still engaged after this long, after varying lengths of time, it's very encouraging. The next talks happen tomorrow and Thursday, and I hope you all join us. The UWC, if you check the chat now, the links to register will be posted there. What will happen next? This is next steps for UWC as a movement. Tomorrow's conversation is going to look at the Black experience in UWC and what that means from an alumni perspective and how we deal with that and grapple with that. It's going to be heavy, but it's going to be great. It's going to be great. I'm so excited for it. And it is about looking at it, you know, taking this whole topic of race and colonialism and empire and all of this education and going into a more micro level approach. It's beautiful. We are also going to be compiling views of alumni and how the issue of race is dealt with across the movement as well, because we really need to look at ourselves and really take a magnifying glass, because I think UWC has done a really good job and we can even do a better job. So that's very exciting. And Christine, I can't wait to continue working with you. Yeah. You know, as you do this session for all our students across the globe, plug in there, because I think you have a youthful, historical, you kind of tied things together. I think it was really well done. And then everyone else on the call, I hope to see you tomorrow and Thursday. Thursday, we delve right into education and the concept of decolonizing and radicalizing education and the systems. So that will be a really interesting call to end with as we move forward collectively. But I hope everybody learned something, even if it was just my name today and Christine's name. Feel free to Google her. I spent a lot of time Googling her the last few days. But, thank you to everyone. UWC, we're still together. We're still strong. If you can join the UWC Foodies group this week on Facebook. Kit, who runs the UWC Foodies group, has dedicated the space to move away from food for a few days. We know we love food, but to give people of color within the movement a safe space to talk about their experiences as well. So if you can't join the talks, you can join that that Facebook group for that discussion. Join our talks tomorrow and Thursday. Also, join the UWC Hub at uwchub.org. That is a great engagement space for all alumni. And I look forward to seeing you all. Have a great morning, noon, night. I know for some of you it's really late, but yay, we did it. Have a fabulous day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamaisha, Christine. Feel free to unmute yourselves and say bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Christine.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.